Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 10th of June 2026. We're delighted to have our final panel on our investigation into student loans and taxation of graduates. And I'm really pleased to welcome two ministers. Lucy Rigby, formerly of this committee indeed, is actually now the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so the Minister responsible for overseeing and agreeing all public spending in the Treasury. So welcome to you, or back to you, Lucy Rigby. And she's joined by the Right Honourable Baroness Jackie Smith, who's the Minister for Skills at the Department for Education. So
also formerly of this committee, but a very long time.
Right, okay. Well, it seems that all the best people come through the Treasury Select Committee. Let's agree that. And I'm really pleased to welcome Peter Swallow MP today, who's guesting from our sister committee, the Education Select Committee. So very warm welcome to you, Mr. Swallow. Over to Yuan Yang MP to kick off, Ms. Yang.
Thank you, Chair. The question that motivates this inquiry is whether the student financial system is fair. We've had an overwhelming response from students and young people who've submitted to our inquiry saying that they don't believe it's fair. And Baroness Smith, in April this year, you described the student loan system as already unfair. What parts of the system do you consider most unfair?
The context in which I made that statement, of course, was the point at which the government decided to cap from the next academic year the maximum interest rate. And that, I think, we felt, given that it had on previous occasions gone well above 7%, and given the concern that there was within the system, and given the risk that the external environment in which we were operating, the global shocks that were potentially going to impact inflation in the UK, that it would be unfair if it then went up to what would have been 7.1%, recognising the concerns that were being expressed about the level of interest. And for that reason, and in that context, we felt it was fairer to put the cap on in the way in which we did.
In terms of the limited amount of resource, of course, that the Treasury has to spend, there are different ways in which that could have been spent. For example, rather than capping the interest rate, increasing the threshold, changing the repayment rates. Was there a particular decision, you think, around interest rates that meant you want to target that instrument rather than other instruments?
Well, I think the decision, as I've suggested, was based on the context in which we made that decision. So interest rates would, particularly at that point, given the potential risks to inflation that the Chancellor had already identified, would potentially have increased, as we can see. In fact, they would have done once we saw the April inflation figures, would potentially have increased in a way that would understandably have brought concern to graduates who were repaying their loans. So that was the context in which the decision was taken, and so that was the reason for focusing on the interest rate cap.
Thank you. And Ms. Rigby, would you agree with Baroness Smith's remarks just then?
Certainly, in the sense of the inherent unfairness in interest rates ticking upwards because of the situation in relation to the Middle East, yeah, absolutely. And wholeheartedly, as Baroness Smith said, that was the motivation behind capping at 6%.
As many people who might be watching this inquiry may or may not know, changing the interest rate doesn't change, of course, the monthly repayment. So in terms of the living conditions of those graduates who are paying the loans, changing the interest rate doesn't change that directly, but it does benefit those who are the most well-off graduates who then repay the total loan. So was there a judgment within the Treasury, Ms. Rigby, about what groups of graduates you wanted to benefit by this change in terms of the differences along the income spectrum?
No, it was a reaction to the position in the Middle East, and a view was taken that this is something which we could do. I mean, it's fair to say, taking a step back and sort of thinking about the fairness of the system as a whole, it's, to be very candid with you, there are a number of things which, in a sort of ideal, perfect world, that I would like to change about it, and I'm pretty sure many others would say the same.
Yeah.
This is a situation, as you know, that we inherited, and as you know very well, there are a number of levers that in theory could be pulled, each of which would have different effects. But the overall context, of course, is that we have to stick to, or we have to bear in mind the overall fiscal position. I think if I may sort of go into a little bit the fairness of the system as a whole, and I've been giving this some, I don't mind saying, some quite deep thought myself, not least because I anticipated the fact of appearing here, but also because I think I've always considered education to be a fundamental public good. And we, of course, now have more people going to university. It's right that we have a student finance system that means that we can enable people to go to university without those upfront costs, because otherwise you would only see wealthy people being able to go to university. But I think that question of fairness, I think the right way to look at it is about fairness to taxpayers as a whole, because there are a number of aspects of student loans and student finance which are very fundamentally different from a commercial loan. The fact of the debt being written off after a set period, but most fundamentally the fact of them being income contingent, so you're only repaying if your income hits a certain level. So I think in all considerations about fairness as to the system, we do have to bear in mind fairness to taxpayers as a whole. And of course, the majority of young people don't go to university.
Yes. You mentioned then that in an ideal world, there are other changes you would have liked to have made, and while it's very unlikely, I think, that the Treasury will see a sudden windfall from somewhere miraculous. In that scenario, do you know what the next step you would like to take would be?
I think we said, and we will continue to keep everything under review, as I hope you would expect us to do so. I think, as I said, we inherited a system. We can talk specifically about Plan 2 and the various parameters and everything that's happened. But I think it's not, it's not a system which, on our side, we necessarily would have designed and taken some of those decisions which the coalition government in particular in relation to Plan 2 took. So we have sought to, where we can and within the context of a fiscally responsible approach, do things like capping interest rates, but we also unfroze the repayment thresholds for 2025 and 2026. And of course, Baroness Smith can talk more about the reintroduction of maintenance loans. So there's a host of things which we have been able to do, but obviously politics is about choices, and the Chancellor's chosen to prioritise a host of things, including lifting the 2-child cap, for example, funding free breakfast clubs, send reform. I know you don't want me to list all the things, so I won't, but I suppose my point is that there've been some decisions that have been taken, some of which, of course, are things which will help graduates, like our renters' rights reform, for example, the money that we're taking off energy bills. But these are all decisions, the student decisions vis-a-vis student finance are taken in the round, I suppose, is the short version of what I'm trying to say.
Can I read between the lines in terms of what your next ideal step would be, to say that you might consider Plan 2 to be the most problematic cohort that you would like to look at? Again, you singled out Plan 2 in your answer just then.
Well, first of all, just to reiterate the point that the Chief Secretary made, of course, when we came into government, we took a series of actions to try to make the system fairer. Threshold increase for the first time since 2021, capping the interest rates, and the reintroduction of maintenance grants. Those were important decisions to be made. We are going further in terms of thinking, and I think the other important point is, of course, Plan 2 remains, as we've seen from your inquiry, very live for those who are in repayment for Plan 2 loans. But of course, it isn't the case that now that anybody who was going to university and taking out a loan would be facing the same terms. They wouldn't be facing, for example, a rate of interest above RPI, because in Plan 5, the rate of interest is already capped at RPI. So that's one of the ways in which the system is already changing. But we will also be wanting to look, certainly in terms of sort of higher education finance, how we can ensure that the system in the future better supports disadvantaged students. That's the reason for bringing back maintenance grants, which of course were stopped 10 years ago in 2016. And it's also the reason for, as the Chief Secretary says, we'll want to continue thinking within the confines of the fiscal challenges that we face and the decisions that we want to make about other areas of policy, and by the way, other areas of education and skills policy as well, where there's been considerable investment. We want to think about what more we can do, but we are this year introducing a new system of student finance through the lifelong learning entitlement, which will provide considerably more flexibility for people about how they study, about the ability to be able to come back to study at different points in their lives, about the ability to do shorter courses, and that of course has implications for how much you need to borrow and how much you will therefore need to repay, and it means you can make your higher education study fit more around your circumstances and the point in your life that it makes sense to do it.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Rigby, we heard from many of the panellists that we saw earlier in this inquiry that they were concerned about the issue of intergenerational fairness, that particularly during the previous government there were a series of changes to student loans, some of them retrospective, but all of which meant that the Treasury went out at the expense of younger people. What would you say to that argument?
I think the assessment as to fairness, and this is partly why I said I've been trying to give it some really deep thought. I think it's multi-layered, and I think that intergenerational fairness when it comes to students specifically, so when I think about myself as a student, I had a Plan 1 loan. My situation relative to someone on Plan 2, and indeed relative to my mum who received a grant.
Not quite old enough to be your mum, but
yes.
I would be in that.
That's why I didn't say you. Yeah. I think if you look at, as I said, the students in each of those cohorts, you can make a case to say the situation that Plan 2 people on Plan 2 is, has elements of unfairness relative to those other generations. And I don't mean to say in anything that I've said so far, I'm not being unappreciative or not acknowledging the the really tough circumstances that some graduates really are in, and we've seen that in the material that's come back to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add something on that, on the intergenerational point? Because I do have the charge made to me that I went to university at a time at which nobody needed to take out loans. But of course, I also went to university at a time when less than 1 in 5 young people went to university. And if we want a system in which we provide those opportunities to take part in higher education to more people, and I believe that both in terms of opportunity for people and in terms of the growth that we need to see in the economy, then we have to find a way of funding the higher education system that is fair and sustainable and allows us to provide those opportunities to far more people.
Okay, well that's interesting because your department, the government actually put evidence to the committee that the government inherited, and I quote, the broken student loan system. So we've heard from the Chief Secretary, Baroness Smith, about the challenges financially of dealing with this, about choices and so on. But if it's broken, how will you be fixing it? What's the long-term plan for sorting this out?
So I think it's some of the things, Chair, that I was talking about previously. So it is what more we can do to support disadvantaged students. So that is the action that we're taking on maintenance grants. It's also the action that we're promoting in universities, supported with some government funding to make sure that student experience once disadvantaged students get to university is as effective as it can be, and that students are essentially supported to make the most of their education. It's about the support that universities themselves can provide in terms of bursaries and particular support for students to be able to access higher education, and it's about the targeted grants that the government provides. Secondly, I said I think it's important that we do make things fairer for graduates, and I think in terms of the increases to the threshold that this government has already put in place, the cap, we've already done that in the way in which we've just discussed. And then it's about the future and how we create a more flexible and student finance system, whilst nevertheless ensuring that the system remains sustainable. And I think it is also about recognising that people will come through different routes to enter higher education. And this comes back to the point that the Chief Secretary rightly made, I think, about the choices that we make about where we focus, even just post-16 education funding, where we're spending over the course of this spending review period over £18 billion per year on post-16 education and skills. But what we've done there is to say, for example, as people around this room may well have lobbied us about, that means that we need more sustainable 16 to 19 education, particularly in further education. That's why we've increased investment by 800 million.
This is all great, but this is not about the broken student loan system directly.
Well, Chair, with respect, I think it is, because what it does is it demonstrates where the government is putting its money in order to support individual students to be able to proceed to higher education, and to support the financial stability of the sector as a whole. And it sort of demonstrates the choices which, as a government, we have made.
You know how many disadvantaged students are getting benefits from increased maintenance loans and grants? What's the percentage, roughly?
Well, that will we will introduce those in academic year 28-29, and they will be £1,000 a year for students below £25,000 family income, and they will be in particular areas that support industrial strategy areas. So we'll have more to say about how that will be determined in terms of courses as we get closer to delivering them.
And that's £1,000. Is that flat cash, or is that inflation indexed?
Well, that's £1,000 at the point at which they're introduced in 28-29. That's £1,000 for year one, year two, and £750 for the third year for an individual student.
Okay, so that's what that will be, even though that, depending what, no inflation link then for.
This is so we're funding this through the introduction of the international student levy, and our current calculation is that that's what we will be able to afford to do as, if you like, the first tranche of maintenance grants.
And do you have any understanding of how much that might make a difference to repayments on a loan for that cohort? And I'm not expecting you might have that direct figure right in front of you right now, but between you, but maybe someone, if you haven't, can you send us that?
Well, I'm happy to provide further information to the committee about the impact that might have. But I mean, quite straightforwardly, it means £1,000 less per year that a student would need to take out on a loan.
My point is that even if you're paying off a loan over 30 or 40 years, the material impact, I mean, not an insignificant measure, because it helps people at that point of making a choice, but nevertheless, over a lifetime, it's not a massive saving, I would suggest.
I think it is.
It's not for that reason that you're pushing it.
It is It is for the practical reason of putting £1,000 into the pockets of the most disadvantaged students who wouldn't otherwise have it. There is an element of it that is about saying we want to begin to bring down the barriers that might exist to disadvantaged students.
And also you mentioned universities' bursaries. Is that university bursaries paid for by universities, or you were talking about bursaries for particular subjects through government funding?
So it can be both. So some universities will, from their funding, provide bursaries for students in particularly disadvantaged circumstances. Some of that will be funded by government money that will come through the Strategic Priorities Grant.
Okay, so again, some of that not government money, and then targeted, by targeted you mean for particular courses or particular students?
Oh no, so when I talked about targeted grants, so within the system there are grants that are available to students, for example, if they were disabled. Okay. So that's what we call targeted grants.
Okay, fine. The jargon of an education
yes,
committee
sorry.
rather than a Treasury Committee. so that's all very well, that's about the student experience, but the evidence was saying the loans system is broken. So you talk about having a flexible future student financial system that's sustainable. So can you just give us a couple of examples of, now look, you're sitting next to the Chief Secretary, you could count it as a bid for the next spending review perhaps, but we know that the money, I'm sure he's already well, yeah, probably dealing with other issues right now, but we know that the funding situation, the Chief Secretary's been very clear about that, we've heard what the Chancellor said about that. What would you like to see in an ideal world? What's your vision for what a future flexible future student finance system that's sustainable? What does that mean in reality?
Well, it means the lifelong learning entitlement system that we're introducing. It means, of course, ongoing government commitment, which is already in the student finance system, because let's not forget, in the system as it is at the moment, on average, 30% of that money that is loaned by students is never repaid, and therefore there is already a considerable government subsidy that goes into the student finance system.
Okay, and we're going to come on to the balance of the government and private sector, but
that is a government investment in precisely into the student finance system and into the loan system.
And you've talked quite a lot about the post-16 agenda. Clearly, you're very proud of that. It's very much core of your portfolio. But in the white paper that you published last October, there was no mention of the student loan system being broken. But in evidence to us recently, you said that was the case. Do you think that there was an impact on breaking of the freezing of the threshold last November, so that's now frozen before the point at which graduates have to start repaying it? It's been frozen. Do you think that's what's broken the student loan system?
No, I don't think that's what broke it. I think it's some of the elements of unfairness that I was talking about earlier. I think it is, and I mean. Actually, Chair, within that white paper, that was also where we talked about the range of other things that we were doing to improve the student finance system. So it wasn't that we didn't mention it, but
it wasn't criticised as much as it was in the evidence. It's just interesting, the change of tone.
Well, look,
it's quite trenchant for a government department or the government to write to a committee saying the system's broken, and we don't usually get that frank language, and that's why we're interested.
We sit in government departments, but certainly no longer me, but lots of other people are also listening to their constituents, receiving correspondence, in my case listening to my children. It's obvious that people feel at this point, for whatever reason it has emerged, concerned about the impact of particularly their Plan 2 repayments on themselves, and it would be false of me to say that isn't something that people have been concerned about.
Okay, I mean we've got a lot of detail to get into, and on further detail I'm going to bring in Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm fascinated by the use that has been so frequent so far of the word fair, because it's obviously a very subjective term. And is 6% interest rate fair, Baroness Nick?
Well, put it this way, I think it's interesting and important that, of course, what students are facing nowadays in terms of Plan 5 student loans, that they began repaying, I think, in 23-24. The interest rate that they'll be facing in those cases is retail price index. So it is already lower than 6%. And I think, to come back to the point that we made earlier, the context for what is fair, I think, is the decisions that you want to make as a government about where you want to focus your resource, because it is of very big impact on the public finances if, for example, we reduced interest rates in the way in which some people have suggested that we should do for Plan 2 loans. That would cost a considerable amount of money. So those are the decisions that we've had to weigh up in terms of the fairness of the interest rate. We were clear that we didn't think that seeing an increase in that in Plan 2 loans, where of course you could be paying RPI plus up to 3% under the scheme, caused by external events which impacted inflation in this country, was fair. And so we took action to cap at 6%.
So you said in your written submission that 7% was unfair. And I think I just didn't hear you say that 6% is fair either. You don't think 6% is fair, do you, Baroness Smith?
No, that isn't what I said. What I said was I think 6% is fair in the context in which we capped it. The point I was making, first of all, was that students who are taking out loans now would be paying a lower interest rate than that at this point. And the other point I was making, the reason why I used the 7% was, had we not capped in the way in which we have done back in April for this forthcoming academic year, students would be facing, graduates repaying a Plan 2 loan would be facing a 7.1% interest rate. That was the comparison I was making. It wasn't about one being fair and one not being.
Is it fair to have frozen the thresholds in the way that the Chancellor did?
Well,
it's another $7.5 billion that's going to be asked of students, just in one move of the pen.
Well, I do have to point out that this government has increased the thresholds 2 years in a row after a period of time when they'd been frozen since 2021, and since they've been in existence since 2012, under the government in which you were a minister, they've been frozen more often than they've been increased.
I know there'll be more questions about the retrospective changes, but I'm going to carry on about interest rates. Some of the evidence we've had has been suggesting that the interest rate really should be just a pass-through of what the government itself pays. Would that be practical, Chief Secretary?
I think the starting point, if I might, Dame Harriet, when it comes to the interest rates and to sort of partially address some of the points which Baroness Smith was making, these are not design choices that we made. These are design choices that we inherited. And so interest rates, along with repayment thresholds and also repayment rate, and the length of the repayment term, each of these parameters of the scheme are things that we inherited. I accept that they are levers that could be altered to mean that in each particular case, either students are repaying less or repaying less over the long term, or or whatever it is. But each of those choices has to be made in a way which is fiscally responsible. And with regard to the interest rate specifically, because, as Baroness Smith referred to, the fact that many graduates simply never pay off their loan, it doesn't make a difference to them, if you see what I mean, because of this very key way in which student finance is different to a commercial loan, in addition with obviously no collateral, no credit history. There's these really key terms in which student loans are made available for the express purpose of allowing people from all sorts of backgrounds to go to university.
You said it was a system you inherited, and of course that is the case, but you've got the changes that you've made have been to reduce the interest rate, which actually, as we heard earlier, benefits those on higher incomes. So is that fair?
It benefits in theory all, but I said, as you say, subject to the fact that those who are not earning above the repayment threshold eventually will get their loan written off or don't over the period of the loan able to pay it off, I should say. But the key thing is that we made that change, the capping at 6%, because we took the view in the context of what was happening in the Middle East that were interest rates to skyrocket, there would be an inherent element of unfairness in that. I also think, for what it's worth, that it's pretty unfair on graduates and indeed on all of my constituents when some of the events under the last government caused certain impacts on our economy, not least the Liz Truss's mini budget. So I think it's really important to bear in mind exactly why we put that 6% cap on interest rates. And you mentioned repayment threshold, so I'll address that directly. I'd just come back to the things that we were talking about at the start, in the sense of that we have to have fiscal responsibility and to look at these things in the round. And the Chancellor's made a series of choices at budget, and indeed those before, to do things like the funding to lift a 2-child cap, funding free breakfast clubs, funding free childcare.
We heard that list before, and I'm actually just going to put on record, Chair, that I think I'm concerned that the Chief Secretary is not aware that interest rates are now actually considerably higher than they were under that 49-day premiership that she alluded to. But on the point about the evidence that this committee has received, I would just like to highlight the fact that of the 52,000 people who've written into us, the thing that they find most concerning about their student loan is the fact that every time they look at their statement, the balance itself has just increased. So I just want to point that out as you think through the different options. That's very much the overall theme.
So the psychological pressure people felt was significant. But Ms. Rigby, did you want to come back on that point?
I think there's a broader point, and I come back to what we were talking about at the start about Dame Harriet referring to fairness. And I do think, because of the nature of the student loan system, and it has all the characteristics that we've described, the right way to think about fairness is fairness to taxpayers as a whole. So I think that really is and as I said, the fact of more than half young people not going to university. I think what really would be unfair to graduates, and indeed to my constituents and to others too, is losing control of the public finances, because I think that has very negative consequences.
Thank you. Thank you very much. John Glenn, MP.
Yes, first of all, could I ask Baroness Smith, you mentioned in your earlier remarks about the difference between when you were a graduate and probably when I was a graduate, roughly a decade later. The number of people.
I beat up Baroness Smith today.
No, I didn't mean it like that. It doesn't matter. It might have been 20.
Well, to be old.
Yeah.
We might want to beat you up on thumbs up and things, but let's leave that.
The point I want to get to is I totally respect the fact that what you're saying, there was a different volume of people going to university than there is now. But we also have the evidence that 39%, I think, of people never pay off their student debt. I just wondered what you think about this sort of narrative that more graduates in all disciplines, in all courses, is sort of given, implicit in what you're saying, is good for the economy. Do you have any comments to make about the sort of range of options around the different courses and whether they provide value for money? Given that striking statistic about those that don't actually. Obviously, some will go into vocations that won't give them higher salaries. We expect that, but many don't. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I will come to that, but just to be clear, the reason why you don't pay off your student loan because of the income that you earn wouldn't necessarily correlate with whether or not you were doing something that was worthwhile for
I think it's
I did acknowledge that, but I am just saying that there's been a massive shift in the volume of people, and I think that it's worth. I think people would expect us to ask the question about your view of the validity of that.
So I certainly think that there is more that we need to do in the system, and we've been clear about this. Firstly, to inform young people who are thinking about what they want to do at university, or in fact whether or not that is the right route for them at all, about what the outcomes of that might be, course by course, subject by subject. So we will be providing more information for students thinking about those options through UCAS, for example, through using some of the, bringing together the information that we have about graduate outcomes so that students can make a more informed choice about the decisions that they're making. That might, of course, mean that they want to look for alternatives. So they might say, okay, well, I think perhaps an apprenticeship route is more suitable for me in terms of the course that the sort of course through life that I want to take, which is why we've seen investment and a pivot of the apprenticeship system back towards young people. We will also take a stronger approach to how we tackle the quality of courses that are being offered. So we've already said, for example, that as we increase tuition fees, we will link that to the quality. So we'll link the ability to index link your tuition fee cap to the quality of what's being produced in your university. And we will also, particularly given some of the concerns about the quality of what is being offered in franchise provision, where there has been a very big expansion of the numbers of students going into higher education. We have already said, of course, that we will expect any franchise provider with 300 or more students to be registered with the Office for Students, and we will want to look very carefully at the quality of what's being offered there.
And thank you for that. In some countries, like France, for example, vastly higher numbers of people would go to university near to their home, removing some of the significant burdens of maintenance costs and so on. Do you think, and we also heard evidence from the previous panel, that the UK system has quite significant sort of wraparound costs around what is offered to a student. Do you see any means of reducing those costs to create a lower burden for the state and the individual?
Well, I mean, first of all, on the point about being nearer to home, we're already seeing in this country a big increase in the numbers of students who commute, who live at home, and that might be for a variety of reasons. I would have to go back and read the evidence about what people meant by wraparound support. I mean, personally, I've actually pushed quite hard for appropriate wraparound support to be put in place for students, because I think actually it's a waste of everybody's money if somebody gets into university and then drops out. Exactly. So the work that we've done on mental health support, some of the targeted grants I was talking about, some of the expectation we're putting on universities in terms of student experience, I think those things are not just sort of some option that we could do away with, but they're part of making a success of the system.
Thank you very much. I turn to the Chief Secretary, and congratulations on your latest promotion. Could I ask you, from your previous role as Economic Secretary, you'd been very familiar with the sort of terms that exist in financial services for loans and so on. Yet we seem to have an anomaly. The Treasury would have, over years of all governments, I think, PFI deals, contracts for difference, that we'd look back on, and probably the Chair has looked through her role in Chair of the Public Accounts Committee to see that they weren't value for money. But we've got this unusual situation with student loans where any government can vary the terms using the carve-out, I think, in the Higher Education Act in the late 80s. Do you think that's fair?
I think that this comes down to what student loans are as a product. And
you mentioned the write-off and the income contingency thing in your earlier answer.
Yeah.
So your argument is that it's a different sort of product, and therefore the government can vary those terms within, freely.
I think it's a different sort of product, and yes. So I've mentioned those key characteristics, but I think the other side of that I think is worth emphasising is the fact that for most people that want to go to university at the point at which most young people want to go, you couldn't get a commercial loan because you don't have the credit history, you don't have the collateral. You certainly wouldn't be able to get something which you could write off if you don't hit certain repayment thresholds. So my point is that student loans, despite having the name that they have, are really very, very different as a product to a commercial loan. And you're right, inherent in there is the fact that because they are so heavily subsidised by the government has the right, as indeed previous governments have done, to change some of those terms of the loan.
But do you think that, therefore, given what you've just said, it'd be better to rebrand the loans as a student contribution, a university education contribution, because it's not really a loan in the conventional sense? Wouldn't that do justice to the essential co-payment that exists between the state and the individual?
I've seen this argument being made. I'm not sure I see the value in changing the name to a graduate contribution. I mean, despite me saying it has these key differences to a commercial loan, it is still a loan. It's something that that students are expected to pay back, as I said, because of those. I think it differs sort of according to cohort. And yes, you're absolutely right. Some people, a large number of people, can never pay it all back. But I'm not sure it's necessarily right to characterise it as a contribution when a sum of money is being loaned with expectation that it would be paid back only on certain terms.
Don't you think, though, that students, having seen the history of different schemes over time and the changes in the thresholds and the rates, etc., there'll come a point where their level of confidence in what they're signing up to will diminish, and therefore, people will, not have confidence. It's not really a good start to in a young adult's relationship with the state, is it? To be in a situation where they've got a sort of dicey product that any government can change.
I wouldn't characterise it as a dicey product. I feel I should specifically
rebut that.
Push back on that. Yeah, absolutely. I've talked, and I won't repeat myself, about why I think student finance is a good in and of itself, in the sense of meaning that you don't have to pay up front to be able to go to university, and education is a public good, etc., etc. I won't repeat myself. But I do think that because of the very large nature of the government subsidy, that you do need a means by which the government, and by obviously when I'm saying government, I'm saying it's obviously subject to parliamentary scrutiny, which is important, can change those terms.
Okay. Just one specific question. I believe one of the retrospective changes to the student loans was the freezing of the thresholds which determined the graduate student loan interest rate. But that wasn't disclosed in the budget document, yet it was scored at £1 billion. Why wasn't, I know you weren't responsible for this at the time, but why do you think that wasn't in the budget document? It was £1 billion in the scorecard subsequently.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to come back to you in writing as to exactly what was there and what wasn't.
Significant number. And it wasn't declared, and I think in terms of transparency, it doesn't do the government or the Treasury any credit.
Let me come back in writing on that precise point, if I may. But I should say my understanding was that everything was done in the right way. But I will come back in writing.
Thank you very much indeed.
Catherine West MP.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. I have two questions for both ministers. The first is that data from the OECD shows that the UK now has the highest private contribution to higher education, the highest levels of student debt in the world, and staff facing redundancy and universities facing insolvency. So I'm wondering, can either minister identify a major stakeholder group that's actually benefiting from the present funding model?
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, on the point about the OECD, the way in which the OECD classifies student debt loan debt in the student finance system, it allocates it as private, despite the fact, as the Chief Secretary has said, that this is a debt which is backed by government, very largely subsidised by government. So I'm not sure that I quite would accept the characterisation of the extent to which that then implies that the UK system is private. On the point about, I think you're sort of linking the system to the financial sustainability of the sector, and I accept your point that the higher education sector is under considerable financial pressure at the moment. I would argue that that is less to do with the structure of the system and more to do with decisions that have been made in recent years. So, for example, as a considerable part of the finance of higher education institutions comes from tuition fees, the decision by the last government to freeze those tuition fees for a period of time essentially led to a fall in the real value of the unit of income that universities were receiving. That's why, when we came into government, we made the decision to increase in the first year the tuition fee income by the rate of inflation. We've subsequently taken through Parliament the ability to be able to do that again, I think, for the next 2 years, and we will, as we've said, legislate in order to link that increase to inflation over time. And in fact, we've already, I'm not arguing, by the way, that the higher education system is out of the difficult time, but we have already seen in the analysis that the Office for Students does of the financial sustainability of higher education institutions, we've already seen a small improvement in terms of the levels of deficit that higher education institutions are facing.
I'll just chip in there that we've seen governments legislate before to make sure that the thresholds are kept, but then the law just changes when government wants to change the threshold. That's governments of different colours have done that. So what guarantee is legislation in this context?
Well, I mean, I think we've made a pretty clear commitment. We've done it for 3 years. We will legislate to put it in, to put an indexation into legislation. I think governments that chose not to stick with that would have to answer for their decisions, wouldn't they, Chair?
Well, okay, but what about the freezing of last autumn?
Now, well, that's a different question. That relates to the threshold at which you start repaying your student loan. Well, I mean, we've talked about that already, and we have...
I suppose my point is, you're saying on the one hand, we can be sure of this under this government, you're very clear that this is a commitment by this government that will stick on that end, but not on the thresholds as that was changed.
And the terms on which students enter into their student loan are quite clear that it is possible that regulations will change the basis on which that that collection is done. But the question I was being asked was, how is the system working for the financial sustainability of higher education? And I was pointing out how it was because of decisions that this government has made.
Order. Order, order. Welcome back to the Treasury Select Committee on the 10th of June 2026. Catherine West MP.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Picking up the international comparisons, perhaps I can ask the Treasury Minister why other competing economies manage to provide higher education at a lower price point for the student.
I think in your question when you asked at the outset, you referred to partially privatise, this being a feature of it as well. My understanding of the classification is such that our system is characterised for methodological reasons as having a higher contribution, but obviously it's the state fronting the money in the way that we've been discussing. But I think that classification does make those international comparisons a bit trickier than it would otherwise do. I think it is interesting to look across at other jurisdictions and how they're doing this, and I think that any sort of, we should all be rightfully curious about ways in which we can improve the system, and clearly part of that curiosity is about looking elsewhere at who does what. I mean, I know certainly just from my own experiences over the many years that there are different models available, including things like a graduate tax. We can get into detail about why I don't think that's the right answer, but obviously there are other ways of doing it.
And Meg, my final question would just be about, we had Vivian Stern from Universities UK in last week talking about that sort of the government funding element and the student funding element, and the fact that one's going right down and the other one is sort of inching up. And I just wanted to reflect to perhaps the two of you, as the conversation will definitely be at some point, is there any more money from the Treasury? Because we know that our student education is one of the jewels in the crown of our trading partnerships, for example, and we need to be aware that there does have to be a government interest and funding at some point for a good, like, university education.
More money, Chief Secretary.
And I just say before I pass to Jack, I mean, it's absolutely right, and I haven't to date, waxed lyrical about just how incredible our universities sector is. We have 4 of the 10 leading universities in the world, and indeed the sector is a huge contributor to economic growth domestically, in addition to all the reasons why education is a huge contributor to economic growth. Jackie,
and I would simply add to that, when we're making international comparisons, I think it is probably worthwhile putting alongside the cost of other systems and the public subsidy of other systems, the quality of what they produce. So, what we have in the UK is a world-renowned higher education system with some of the best outcomes anywhere in the world, including other systems in which there is actually a larger public contribution. So this goes back to the point about quality, which I think is an important one. I could also, if you want to, I could also take on the point, for example, that has been made about whether or not we should, what the proportion is of what's being...
Briefly, because it would answer the point from you UK last week.
Yeah.
That slide is completely different from how it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay.
And that is, as I've suggested, due to some of the decisions made by the last government. It means that we now find ourselves in a position where, for example, around 30% of the annual student loan outlay in any financial year is forecast not to be repaid, and therefore that's a 30% government subsidy. If you then add in additional money around some of the grants that I was talking about, and some other, the strategic priorities grant as well, which is government support for universities, we then have a government overall contribution in the region of 35% to 40%. Now, I know that there is a call. I've heard Philip Auger make this argument for 50-50. I mean, essentially, with one part of me, I have sympathy for the idea that the government might fund higher education more, but that is what it is. It is a request for more public investment into higher education, which, as the Chief Secretary has quite rightly said, needs to be weighed up against the other priorities that not just the Treasury, but even we in the Department for Education have. And we have made decisions about where we invest money. And
all about choices, as the Chancellor repeated.
It has been in early years, it's been in special educational needs, it's been in 16 to 18 education. Those are the choices that we are employed to make in government.
Thank you very much. And, another warm welcome to Peter Swallow, guesting from the Education Select Committee. Mr. Swallow.
Thank you very much, Chair. And as a member of the Education Select Committee, Baroness Smith, you'll not be shocked to hear I'm very interested in the issue around the financial stability of the sector. And indeed, we look forward to receiving your response to our report on higher education and funding in due course. You mentioned in your previous responses there about how the loss of revenue from tuition fees under the previous government had increased instability in the sector, if I can paraphrase your words. Mm-hmm. Well, the latest British Attitude Survey shows the proportion of people who believe a university degree is not value for money has jumped from 14% in 2005 to 34% in 2025. I'm sure, as many colleagues around this table have had conversations with young people in their constituencies telling us that they're choosing not to go to university in part because they're very anxious about high repayments of student loans. Is there a risk to the financial stability of the sector that young people take a look at the products on offer and simply say, I don't think that is value for money for me?
Well, I very much hope not, but I do think it is important, first of all, that we are clear that what young people are being offered in higher education is of high quality, and that refers to some of the points that I was making earlier, that it is the right choice for an individual, and that's the reason why we will provide more information for young people thinking about their choices, to be able to look at what they might expect in the broadest possible terms, the sort of opportunities that a particular course might open up for them, including in terms of earnings, including in terms of the contribution to the economy. It's why we need, I think, to be, but that does come back to the point about how we ensure that the students understand the range of choices that are available to them within the needs of the country. The Prime Minister has set a clear target that 2/3 of young people should be able to do level 4 or above qualifications by the age of 25. Those level 4 or above qualifications include a range of things. They do, of course, include a traditional route through higher education. They include a level 4 or 5, or in fact 6 apprenticeship. They include higher technical qualifications offered by universities. Now, that range of choice, which we need to make sure students understand about, I think is the best way of ensuring that there are the right things for students who want to make the choice that works for them, and that those are backed up by information that will tell them about what the what it will do for their prospects as an individual if they do those particular courses. Including
presumably good information about what it means to take out a student loan.
Absolutely, and I do think that's an important point that I want to come back to from earlier. There is a lot of information out there for students at the point at which they make a decision about whether or not they take out a student loan. I'm very open to the idea that we should think even more about how we can improve that. I know that the Student Loans Company has, for example, advisory group which includes students on it to help to think through the information that's provided. They produce on gov.uk as well as the SLC, there is information about what you are taking on when you take on a student loan. They describe it as speed bumps that mean that as you are reading the terms and conditions that you are entering into in a student loan, you are forced to sort of slow down and accept that you have understood what those terms and conditions are before you're able to go on to the next stage. There's lots of non-government information out there about the nature of the loan and what you're taking on. But, any ideas that come out of this inquiry or any other suggestions that people have about how we can improve information, I'm very open to, and I talk regularly with the student loans company, and I'm more than happy to talk to them about that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swallow. John Benham, please.
Yes, and could I ask Baroness Smith about some of the evidence we've received around, particularly from the student loans company, about the level of understanding that students have about the loans they're taking out, because it appears that the vast majority, or a lot of them, didn't know about those loans. What do you think about that evidence?
Well, what I saw in terms of the student loans company evidence, and what I see when I look at what's being provided for students, goes back to my previous response. I think as of this moment, I think quite a lot of work rightly happens to make sure that people, particularly young people, as they enter into a student loan arrangement, understand the terms and conditions. They understand the nature of what they're doing. I know that the student loans company also want to use, I'm not a comms person, but they want to use what they would describe as multi-channel approaches to ensuring that targeted information gets to particular groups of students, for example, estranged students. They want to make sure that they use different ways of communicating that. And as I said earlier, when you take on a student loan, you have to sign to say that you have understood the terms and conditions. Now, any of us know that I have to.
You're not going to pretend you've got confidence.
I have to confess to not having always read all of the terms and conditions of every financial arrangement that I've entered into. That's why I think it's also quite important that there are other routes for students to understand both the quality and the value of what it is that they're undertaking, and also the nature of what they're entering into when they take on a student loan. And I do think that some of the important positives that we've already talked about, the fact that if your income drops below a certain level, you won't be expected to make repayments. You will have if you haven't repaid, your loan will be written off after 30 years for Plan 2 or 40 years for Plan 5. That's quite important information.
I accept that, but do you think that given the uncertainty and the apparent evidence that despite that stipulation that you have to tick that box, the evidence is that people did not grasp that any future government could change materially the terms and conditions of the loan? Would it not be wise to instruct the student loan company to make that a very explicit, clear condition that is made transparent to all of those that take it alongside those other things that you mentioned quite reasonably about things being written off and so on?
It is obvious that there are lots of people who feel that they didn't realise that was potentially going to happen. It's completely fair to say that. I would just, in evidence, point to page 1 of the Student Loans, A Guide to Terms and Conditions 26-27, where it says, in terms, the regulations may change from time to time, which means the terms of your loan may also change. And then gives further information about how, quite a lot of further information about the nature of it.
That clearly hasn't been effective as a communications mechanism.
Which is why I say I'd be, more than happy to hear any further suggestions about what more we could do, or the student loans company could do, to make sure that the messages about student finance are communicated.
I think the Minister is giving us an opportunity for a recommendation, Chair. Could I just turn to earnings to pay off the loan? In terms, there's another point really, I suppose, about transparency. I understand the Department was unable to give us the number of how much a graduate would have to earn in their lifetime to pay back their loan on average. It just seems a bit odd, because it's sort of quite a key part of the the system. Does the department know what that number is now? You do it for the top 3 lifetime earnings groups, but not as a whole.
I think we can go further than we have gone to provide information to support the committee. I do think it's important, though, to be clear that I wouldn't be comfortable with saying, if you earn X over your lifetime, you will therefore be able to repay your loan, and I'll explain why not in a moment. Because, of course, as we've already pointed out, this is not, unlike a mortgage, this is not a loan which you repay whatever the level of your income and you have to have repaid it in a certain period of time. So there are all sorts of things that will impact the extent to which you're repaying. But each year the department does produce, here's my second document, the department does produce a publication called Student Loan Forecasts for England. That itself includes information on the average borrowing per student and the average repayment per student. We publish it around July. When we do it this July, given the interest of the committee, we are working to be in a position to publish more information on that relationship between borrower earnings and loan repayment. For example, presenting the proportion of borrowers in different post-study earnings bands with pound values who are forecast to finish repaying their loan before it is written off. So that you could, for example, I hope what we'll be able to deliver is the ability for people to say, if your post-study earnings amount to X number of pounds, above that, almost all borrowers will repay their loans. Just to come back to the point about how I wouldn't want that to be turned into if you earn this amount, you will repay their loan.
There'll be illustrative guides.
Yes, they'll be illustrative. And just to explain why I wouldn't want us to get into the position which we've been talking about of misleading potential students about that. Just let me give you 2 examples about the way the system works. If you are a Plan 5 borrower and you have earnings of you could be in a position where you had one borrower had earnings of 1.74 million. Their earnings were 25,000, and over their working life they track the repayment threshold. Despite earning 1.74 million over their life, they would repay nothing because they would never get above the repayment threshold. But you could have somebody who earned less than 550,000 over their working life, but because they earned it at a very high income for a few years, they might repay all of their student loan. So that's just by way of saying, I don't want us to be in a position where we're saying, this number means you would repay your loan, because I think that would risk misleading people in the way in which we've obviously been talking about not wanting to do.
So it sounds like the department, and probably the Treasury as well, can actually do that calculation, but for presentational reasons it's undesirable to publish it.
No, that isn't quite what I said.
I wasn't trying to misrepresent it, I was trying to get to the heart of it. It seems to me that you can do the calculation for the top 3 deciles of earning. You have produced a table which tells us those in the top 3 lifetime earnings groups will pay off their loan in full, which implies that you could proceed and do that data for everyone.
Well,
the remaining 7 deciles.
I think we could. So what I'm committing to doing is going further than we have done to say for different levels of earnings, what would be the extent of the amount that would be paid, and therefore above what level would the majority of people repay their loan. Which I think goes further than anything we've produced before, and we can do that alongside the student forecast publication that we publish in July. But you're right, if somebody then said, if you earn that amount of money, you will repay your loan, they would be wrong in any particular individual case.
Because the point you've very clearly made is that the distribution over a working life of when you earn that money within that total materially changes the amount you pay back, and therefore you'd have misleading headlines. That's what you're saying.
Because it interacts with the fact that unlike other loans where you might be more able to do that, you are not paying below a certain income level, so therefore the trajectory of your earnings impacts on it. I think that's the important point.
Thank you very much.
I mean, we were very grateful to receive the material from your department, Baroness Smith, about the promotional materials from the 2010s and the early 2020s. And that didn't mention that terms and conditions could be changed. But you're saying, so that new document is the modern...
This is the current.
Yeah, so that's now set in that the department will continue to do that, because that was quite a concern for us when we were looking at this information.
I can't answer confidently for what was available at the time, but I don't think it was the case, and certainly the legislation on which the loans were based was clear that regulations could change the terms and conditions. So to that extent, it was known, but I can be confident that it is clearer now.
I mean, the challenge here, isn't there? Because what you read out is, it's true, and what you said. But if you're a student, 17-year-old, and perhaps their family and their teachers, there's a lot else that's going on. You won't be able to go to university without a loan in most cases. So it's Hobson's choice. Even if you read the terms and conditions, for a lot of young people, it's quite a lot to understand. And the department at the time put this forward as it compared the cost of student loan repayments to a mobile phone contract. In fact, in one extraordinary thing, it also compared it to £12 a month to go to nightclubs, which we all think is quite cheap for a nightclub. But anyway, maybe we're living in a different world. Do you think, though, that there's this real sense that they were missold at the time? I mean, they can't legally be missold because the law doesn't allow governments to sell, but there was they seem extraordinary comparisons. Do you think that was fair?
Well, I think the student loans company has apologised for some of the comparisons that it made at the time.
But on the benevolent thing, it was trying to make it simple. So
yes.
So where do you get the balance?
So I think you get the balance through all of the information that I've talked about. Also, given, as you say, these are young people who may well want to engage in a conversation or to see a range of information. Things like the Student Room website, where the SLC facilitates part of the conversations that might go on within it, might well be a way that perhaps people could ask questions about things they didn't understand about the loans, about the terms and conditions, and get more of a hopefully accurate but also helpful way to think about it.
It's like a webinar, but with or a sort of question and answer session. Because there's a danger there about in the financial world, if you had an unqualified person trying to sell people advice.
Well, that's why I wouldn't. Yeah. That's why I wouldn't do it. But it is that this particular bit, as I understand it, is staffed and facilitated by student loan company people.
Okay, that's something to find out more. But when we had Philip Auger in front of us, he did compare the selling of student loans to the PPI and car loan mis-selling cases. Do you?
Well, I think he's wrong.
I think he's wrong. Okay, that's very categorical. But do you think it's now a problem? I mean, because you talked about, we've said this, we're very clear on this. You've talked about the interest rates and what you're tying things down in law. Do you think there's confidence out there that what the government says today is going to be upheld in future, given what the history is, particularly of Plan 2 loans?
Well, look, we have looked at the response that you got to your survey. We've listened to what people have said about the way that they feel both about the situation that they're in now and their confidence in the system. I think we've talked quite a lot about the choices that would need to be made and the consequences of changes to that system over and above what we've already done, the cost, for example, and therefore the opportunity cost to other things that we might invest in. I've said that I think it's important that we keep thinking about how we communicate and give people confidence about what it is that they're entering into. Just as I can't answer for past governments. I can't answer for future governments either, I'm afraid, but I think people need to.
Philip Auger's quite very highly respected in this area, and he was very clear, and he looked into this in great detail. Why do you think he's wrong?
Because I don't believe that the illegality that or the nature of what happened, for example, you used the comparison of the PPI position. I don't think this is equivalent to that.
For what reason?
Because however difficult they might have been to see, I think the terms and conditions and the nature of the legislation that was clear that regulation could change provisions in the future existed at the time.
I think there's maybe just a disconnect from the world of Whitehall and the world of 17-year-olds. That in Whitehall it seems logical, the boxes were ticked, the information was on the website, there's small print, there's legislation saying that these things can happen, all perfectly watertight and wrapped up with a bow in government. But then when you actually launch it out there and 17-year-olds have a look at this, they don't read it in the same way at all. Do you think both those positions could be true at the same time?
Yes, and that's why I said I think the range of different ways in which information is provided, both by government and the SLC and more widely, is important, and that we keep thinking about how we can improve it.
And of course your department's introducing financial education training. I can't remember, a minister told me that they'd been to visit one where year 6 students were being taught all sorts of interesting things. So do you think is this the whole issue around student loans going to be part of that?
Well, I wouldn't like to rewrite the national curriculum in this committee at this point, but you are right that better financial literacy is part of the changes that we will make to the curriculum.
Okay, well maybe maybe there's another opportunity for another committee to make a recommendation. Thank you very much, Baroness Smith. Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move on to the question of distributional effects and social mobility. We heard from previous panels, particularly Sir Philip Auger in his review, who recommended that there should be a 50-50 split between the individual's contribution to higher education and the state's contribution through general taxation. Right now, for university students going to university on the Plan 5 scheme, this is more than 90% on the individual and less than 10% on the state. Ms. Rigby, I was wondering if you could describe why you feel the general taxation system isn't sufficient to just capture the higher income from higher earners over the country more generally, rather than placing that subsidy on one specific cohort in society, i.e. those going to university?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it goes back to the issues that we were discussing at the outset about the value of education to society as a whole, but also to the individuals that take out loans and go to university. And as we've been discussing, we still have a position where less than half of young people go to university, the majority don't, and that's the current position. That ratio's been different over previous generations. But you come back to this question about fairness not only to students, to current and former students, but to the taxpayers as a whole, and that's when this question about the contribution, I think, the overall contribution, but that of course is not just about student finance, it's about the additional areas of funding that Baroness Smith has been referring to, the further ways in which her department is supporting the sector.
We heard from Universities UK who gave quite a striking example of social or public goods caused by going through higher education. That, for example, if you're in an accident, then the person who sews you back together again in the hospital will have gone through a university degree. And so, of course, there's an extent to which, like many public goods, going to university is good for you individually, and that might increase your earnings. It may not as well, but it's also certainly good for society in different situations. Do you or does the Treasury have a kind of in-principle approach to estimating what that theoretical level of fairness should be in terms of what the public good benefits from and what is the individual benefit, and therefore what should be the ratio of state versus personal contribution, or is that not really the way in which the Treasury has arrived at its current system of student finance?
I mean, the blunt answer in which is that we inherited what we inherited. That's how we arrived at the situation that we are in. And as we've talked through, we wouldn't have designed some of these parameters in the way that they currently exist. But I think the more sort of direct answer to your question is, I am not kind of, any of us, we're not sat with a blank sheet of paper being able to design a system which we're dealing with what we have.
Would the Treasury or the Department of Education have a sense, and I'm not asking for a kind of 3 decimal point figure, but a sense of direction as to whether the current level of individual contribution is the right amount or too high or too low, just a kind of general sense of direction there?
I don't mind answering in the sense of saying, I think that the Chancellor's said this as well, if it was open to us from the wider point of view of, within the kind of envelope of fiscal responsibility, to make some of these changes to the levers that we've been discussing, I certainly would be pushing for us to do that. Come back to some of the responses that you've had
in order specifically to have greater contribution from general taxation rather than from the individual.
More from the point of view of easing the position that I know that some graduates are in, and particularly those on Plan 2. That would be the sort of the driver from my own point of view.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, you're of course right that there is an element of higher education that is a public good. There's also quite a considerable element that is a private good in that, and this is where the design of the student finance system, I think rightly and fairly, is based both on a contribution from the student who will receive those private benefits in terms of their lifelong earnings. If they do, they will repay. If they don't, they won't. And there is an element of public good. And that's the reason for some of the ratios that I was talking about earlier. So it is already the case that for full-time undergraduates, government's overall contribution is in the region of 35 to 40%. So that is a considerable government subsidy which recognises that point that you've raised, as does the fact that if you think about overall higher education income in the 2024-25 financial year, that was £46.1 billion that the higher education sector received, divided between tuition fees, therefore student contributions, international student contributions and research, and out of that 46.1 billion, the government was responsible for 16.4 billion of that. In other words, 36% of what was funding universities was coming from government contribution.
Thank you very much, Majid. Peter Swallow, MP.
Thank you, Chair, and I should quickly declare that I'm the Chair of the APPG for Social Mobility, and I want to raise social mobility. Baroness Smith, you've spoken very eloquently about the benefits to the individual of a university degree, which in very many cases remains a very powerful tool of social mobility. But I want you to imagine for a second 2 students going to university from my constituency. Student A is fortunate enough to come from a very advantaged background, and their parents can afford to pay their student loans up front, and they graduate with a good degree and enter the workforce without student loan repayments ever being on their plate. Student B is not in a similar position and will spend for a considerable period of the rest of their lives earning at the same point in their careers, imagining they get the same jobs and move through the same career paths, 9% less in terms of their take-home pay for the rest of their careers in many instances. I'll just put it to you that is a barrier to social mobility, isn't it?
It is obviously the case that if you have in any system that included an element of loan finance, that would be the case. So to that extent, ever since 1990, when loans were first introduced into the student finance system, that discrepancy has occurred. So yes, you're right, and the only way to get round that would be to move to a fully funded grant system. In doing that, of course, you would be making a very, very big financial fiscal commitment, which of itself, given some of the other things that we've talked about, some of the choices that the government has made, would imply far fewer people going to university, potentially far less money for universities, far less ability to get people to the position where they would be likely to get into university in the first place, if they had special educational needs, or if they needed an FE education, or if they needed to benefit from the start in life that early years investment gives them. So, yes, but the way in which you solve that, I think, is problematic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swallow. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. We had a number of submissions from students who felt that the marginal tax rates that they were facing were particularly unfair, and that's because they're often paying their student repayments on top of everything else that somebody with the same income, but say of a different generation to them, might be paying, and so they can make that comparison in their own workplaces. Do you think these complaints are justified, Ms. Rigby?
I think I'm right in saying that the fact of having a student loan adds about 9%. And I think that, ultimately at root, we, as a government, want to see, and we have, a progressive system when it comes to income tax. And we also want to be able to provide student finance on in as fair ways can possibly be provided, set in the parameters that, with the aims that Baroness Smith has set out, which of course is to allow people to access higher education no matter their background. I think it's obviously within the fact of wanting to ensure that we have a progressive system. It is right, therefore, that graduates that earn more once they've left university, as indeed is the case for anyone graduate or non-graduate, that when their earnings reach a particular level, that they are contributing more to the system. So I think that the fact of wanting, as I said, student finance and our taxation system to be progressive is at the root of that.
And I appreciate that point about the progressiveness of the income tax regime. And I suppose I'm speaking to more of a sense of, again, intergenerational unfairness, that there is this cohort of young graduates who have, from their perspective, done what their teachers and parents have encouraged them to do, gone to university, worked hard, and are paying so much in tax and are facing such a difficult economic circumstances compared to, say, their parents' generation, that they're much less likely to get on the housing ladder at the same time in their lives, compared to those of an older generation who may be earning this in the same tax bracket, so earning the same amount of income, but simply more asset wealthy, plus not paying the student loan repayment issue. And that is really a sense of felt unfairness from those who wrote into us. And what would you say to that?
That I appreciate that, as I hope I've made clear in my answers so far. What I think it is important to bear in mind, though, is some of the features of student finance that we've been discussing. So the repayment rate of 9%, and indeed the thresholds being set as they are, the interest rates, etc., the various parameters of the loans. One of the key features that I think is really, really important is the fact that lower earners are protected, that we have these repayment thresholds as a feature overall. So I think whilst I acknowledge and I understand that concern, I think if you are attached to having a progressive system, one aspect of that is if you want to protect the lower earners, there are other ways in which the system has to reflect that as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Young. Jim Dixon, MP.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Something that came through in the evidence that we had was the sort of psychological pressure, that the notion that you're repaying a loan which is going to be there for a long time, no matter what you earn. And one thought that certainly has occurred to others before, and Sir Philip Auger was clear on this, but also it came through in people's suggestions for how the system might change would be just to accept that this isn't a conventional loan in the normal sense. You don't necessarily have to pay the whole thing off. It doesn't require credit history. There are various aspects of it that make it not really resemble that sort of financial product. Baroness Smith, would it not be a good idea if we just did call it a graduate contribution or something of that nature, rather than try to pretend it's a loan with all the pressures that creates, given what people's experiences of loans in other parts of their lives are?
Well, I do say I thought that the Chief Secretary very clearly explained why that wouldn't necessarily be wouldn't be the right thing to do. I think, given that we've spent quite a lot of time, understandably, talking about the clarity and transparency of the information that we're giving to people when they take out a student loan, I think the fact is this has the elements of a loan, which is you have borrowed money, you are expected to repay it under a set of terms and conditions, which do protect you in the way in which we've described. Secondly, it is, in legislative terms, a loan. That's the basis on which it is paid by the government. So I'm not sure that all of the problems that this inquiry has identified are solved. If only they were solved by a renaming to something else. And I noted, which I thought was interesting, that the representatives of the campaigns and the NUS in their evidence also didn't think that renaming was the answer. Well,
it's certainly on its own.
Yes.
Absolutely. If it was just a case of legislation, it presumably wouldn't be that difficult to rename it in terms of the legislation.
No, I wasn't saying that the legislation calls it a loan. I was saying the basis on which it is paid legislatively is that it is a loan. And in fact, it's paid on the expectation that it will be repaid. With a set of things that limit you having to repay depending on your income and having it written off after a period of time. But it acts like a loan in that you borrow the money and you expect to repay it.
One other idea, again, it's really about the way in which the transaction that people are engaged in is described, but I think it is still quite important, is that the student loan company, when it provides its annual statements to people on their repayments and how much they still have to repay, might actually include a statement about how much of the loan might be written off if that particular person continues to repay at the rate they are. And people then will find it easier to understand that although it seems like a large amount of money, actually 50% of people, it may well be the case for the individual who's receiving the statement, that they won't have to pay the whole thing off. And that's made a bit clearer. And again, that being a bit easier for people to deal with.
I understand the point that's being made, and I very much understand this point that the committee has made about the psychology of seeing you having a very large, seeing your debt going up. I think the problem, let me think about it more, but I fear that the problem might be the problem that I was talking about earlier, which is to say to an individual, you will definitely not have to repay, or you definitely will have to repay if X. There's an awful lot of moving parts in that, and whether or not that actually helps people to understand, I'm not sure whether or not it does. I think probably we should be clearer about what the mitigations are here. We should keep reminding people that if you earn below a certain level, you pay nothing. If you have still got loan debt after 30 years for Plan 2, it is completely written off, unlike any other sort of debt that you might have or loan that you might enter into. I think we need to keep making that clear, but I'm not sure that individual numbers for individual people help them, and that they might risk misleading them.
Thank
you very much. And Ms. Rigby, we've heard a lot about this, how it's described, about mis-selling. In your former job as Economic Secretary to the Treasury, would you have been, and indeed in your current role, would you be happy for a financial product being sold by a finance company?
What you were going to say, Chair, in my role prior to that, which was Solicitor General.
Well, there you go. Whichever hat you wish to wear, Ms. Rigby, multi-talented Ms. Rigby. But yeah, so would you have been happy in the financial sector for a product to be sold the way this has been sold to students, to more prospective students.
I have to be honest, Chair, in the sense of not being as familiar as Baroness Smith is with the sort of historic nature of the... Sorry, I didn't mean that. No.
Another go.
I haven't been around as long as Baroness Smith has.
I didn't mean that. Baroness Smith was speaking with a degree of familiarity with as to how loans have been provided and the sort of documentation, and indeed she made the good point, of course, that she can't answer for decisions that previous governments have made, but I am simply not familiar with exactly what information was provided.
Well, but the information is provided,
time.
And then the thresholds have changed, and the different governments' interest rates have changed. Yeah, there have been changes made, good and bad, because when interest rates reduce, people are happier about that, obviously. But would you be happy if a financial product had been sold in this way?
I mean, look, I think I'm right in saying that the CCA doesn't apply to.
No, it doesn't. It's a special legislative carve-out for
but
government. But nevertheless,
think,
if this was the approach taken...
But I think, I mean, and again, I defer to your, and indeed Baroness Smith's understanding, but I think I'm right in saying the general principles of the FCA should apply, and indeed do apply to student finance. So I think in that context, if you wanted to make a judgment about this, you could, but I'm simply telling you that I don't have all of the...
Because in legislation, there is no ability... In fact, it prohibits sort of... It describes you can't mis-sell this product because legislatively that's not possible. And nevertheless, we've seen changes of terms and conditions, information provided, which I'm not attempting to put any wool over your eyes, was factually provided by the department, saying things that just were not actually 100% accurate. I think probably with best intent to try and make it easier for people to understand, but written by policy officials rather than be people with a financial background. We are guessing, so that's a surmise because of what we've seen. Do you think there's a duty of care that government should have to young people, as you've already highlighted, without a credit history, who are very young, making these decisions, and in the context that it's a Hobson's choice, if they don't take a loan, most of them will not be able to go to university. Do you think there's a stronger duty of care that should be taken on board by the government?
I think it's critically important that the information that is provided to students is accurate and done so in a way that's a plain English version, which is indeed the standard that you would expect in other contexts as well. But I wholly appreciate the strength of feeling that the committee's heard in relation to this issue, and I think it's incredibly important that we get this right going forward.
Because a very high percentage of people say they wouldn't have done it if they'd known what they'd landed themselves with.
I saw that. Yeah.
And others saying, though, even knowing what they know, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to go, so they would still grudgingly do it, but not really, but they would have rather have known more. So, well, I mean, I appreciate that your minister's time. We are going to move on to defence matters. So, Baroness Smith, if you wish to leave, you may. But if you do,
answer some questions.
or we could throw you some questions on defence spending.
I'll stay in a sort of supportive.
That's nice.
There you go. Well, okay. So, just some quick factual questions. We are obviously all expecting, we're waiting with bated breath for the announcement of the Defence Investment Plan, and we appreciate there was an urgent question in the House. But we've heard all the talk is that this will be before the NATO summit. Can you give any clarity on the date that we might hear about the Defence Investment Plan?
Of all the people that I would consider gazumping on an announcement, the Prime Minister would be the last of those. I know that he has been clear that, exactly as you said, Chair, that the Defence Investment Plan will be published before the NATO summit.
Which is for records on the 7th and 8th of July. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Also, there's been speculation about how the commitment to move from 2.6% of GDP on defence to 3.5% will be funded. There's obviously been a long-standing big hole in the defence budget and lots of challenges about spending there. But the speculation is that to fund this, and understandably money has got to come from somewhere, the capital spend in each department will have to give up some of its capital spending. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I'm afraid you'll forgive me, Chair.
Okay.
I don't think it would be the right thing to do for me to comment on that.
Okay.
Or indeed
Well, so
to
could you
create
perhaps
the
explain that, given we've had the spending review and all the settlements were made for departments, what's the mechanism, were that to be the case, for a good department to give it up? Do you as Chief Secretary simply click your fingers and departments have to do what you tell them? Or do you have to go through some more formal mechanism for them to if they were being asked in a hypothetical situation to give up some of their capital spending towards defence?
Sorry, I'm contemplating legislation to that effect, which would be
If only you could do that now.
I think it's a fair question as to process and how all of this will be done. But again, I hope, Chair, you'll forgive me. I really don't want to get ahead.
Normally, when a spending review is settled, it's settled. So you had kind of to do this, you would have to sort of open it up again, wouldn't you?
I think
within certain parameters.
When the DIP is published, all of this surrounding information as to how the further money for defence will be funded will be made clear.
Okay. Just for the context, we did hear very clear evidence last week that, as many of us know, there's been a long-standing gap in the defence budget between what the country needs and what was the money available. And that was before the increase in defence spending. But to increase from 2.5 to 3.6% of GDP is £500 per person in the UK, or the whole of the transport budget. So that's just setting it in context. But you've also got, presumably across your desk, discussions about the multilateral defence mechanism and the Defence Security and Resilience Bank. And it seems that the government's tending towards the MDM, the European model. Can I just ask what conversations you are having with the Canadians in particular about the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, and whether there's something on your agenda?
I'm happy to confirm that that we are having discussions with various parties about how we can collaborate to ensure that we are better defending and enforcing our collective security. Absolutely right to refer to the MDM, indeed to Finland and the Netherlands and other partners as well. And those discussions are ongoing.
What about the Defence Security and Resilience Bank? Is that something that's come across your desk? Are you talking to people about that as well?
We're currently, I think, as you know, Chair, not part of that.
Okay, but not part of it now, but because that is an interesting mechanism. Mark Carney's been leading on it as Premier of Canada, of course. And the DSRB has been very clear that funds in it will only be spent within industries of members of the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, member nations of that. So if the UK is not in it, they will not spend any money of that, or use any of that credit support for British businesses. Are you aware of that?
I'm happy to say, look, I think, as I said, there are many, many discussions in this space which are ongoing, and clearly the objective amongst allies is to make sure that each of the bits of kit that we have all work together, and that we're all securing the best value for money that we can. We're not currently part of the DSRB. We've talked about the MDM, and as I said, we'll continue to have discussions with our allies, because our interests are as I set them out, and indeed their shared interests across.
And we've had evidence that let's take an example of a business that's a £2 million turnover but can only get £15,000 worth of credit from a normal high street bank. So you're acknowledging, I think, that there is a need for a bigger defence credit mechanism across our allies.
I think it's absolutely right that we're having discussions that go to ameliorating that problem, as indeed I think it's right, and I think you're rightfully questioning me on defence, because I appreciate this is a really significant matter of public interest. The Chancellor has already committed to spending an additional £270 billion on defence over the course of this Parliament, and the Prime Minister's been clear, not least in his speech at the Munich Security Conference, that we will spend more money on defence. And as to come back to where you started, Chair, the DIP will be published in a few weeks' time, and we'll see that.
And the Chancellor's also been very clear about buying British and has talked about this in defence, but with the defence value chains and supply chains, actually some things just can't be bought British because our allies and our relationships mean that we'll do things. Do you think there's going to be any likely change? And if we're not in the DSRB and it's got money to spend, it won't be buying British. So are there any conversations that are going on about supporting British industry in defence procurement?
I think that buying British is an important consideration, not only in this context, but as the Chancellor's made clear in all procurement contexts, because it's a key means by which we can be supporting our economy domestically.
Is there a plan to try and mandate that in the defence sector, which has got many complications?
You'll forgive me, Chair. I'm afraid. I keep saying you'll forgive me. You haven't told me that you're going to forgive me. I just hope that you will, for not wanting to delve into the subject matter of discussions, which, as I said, the DIP will be published in due course.
Ms. Coughlin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Secretary, we've of course discussed this many times. The economic benefit of increased defence spending if done correctly. I was very concerned to see the reports in the Sunday Times about cutting capital spending elsewhere, which of course I understand you can't comment on, but if the government was to cut capital spending elsewhere, you take the risk that the net economic impact of the DIP is negative if that results in lower capital spending overall, especially on R&D. So given everything we discussed, would you share my frustration if the DIP actually has a negative economic impact on the UK overall?
I think I'm very clear, as indeed we've been discussing in relation to student finance, that the Chancellor's view on the public finances is such to wanting to and indeed continuing to adhere to her fiscal rules. So I think it's important to bear that in mind when considering what may or may not happen in future.
Of course, but there are different types of public spending. There's capital spending and current spending. Capital spending has far more economic impact, positive economic impact, than current spending. So would you agree that it would be, in an ideal scenario, that at a minimum there should be no net decrease in capital spending and government expenditure, which would have a fiscally neutral impact?
I think, look, I'm a huge proponent of more capital spending. I think this is something that marks out this government as different from the last. The fact of putting an extra 120 billion into capital spending. So, look, I think this is an important consideration across the piece.
Right, and how carefully is the government considering the advice of Draghi, which of course was to the EU, but that you can raise economic growth by borrowing for defence R&D and decrease debt because growth increases faster than debt, in terms of thinking about the impact of the defence investment plan?
You're going to forgive me, Mr. Coughlin, again. I really am very, very reluctant to get into any level of detail at all about something which is yet to be published.
Which then brings us to my final question. I'm sure you're aware we are trying to secure your presence and the presence of the Defence Procurement Minister in front of us to discuss this once it is published with our sister committee, the Defence Select Committee. I'm sure he's very keen to come. I'm sure you are too, once it's published.
I understand, Chair, you've asked me for a formal response, and that will be provided.
We would hope to do that, though, before the end of the summer recess, given the timetable on this very important issue, which is incredibly important to the security of the nation, but obviously we recognise a huge challenge for any government to increase defence spending to the level that's now required. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time, Baroness Jackie Smith, formerly of this parish, and Lucy Rigby, MP, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, formerly of this parish. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and we're aiming to produce a report on the issue of student loans and student finance before the summer recess with a fair wind behind us. So can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. Order.